as you begin to question the assumptions that they were your presuppositions, you worked from them, but you recognize that maybe they're flawed, but they're definitely historically conditioned. Then you can become more aware of that and more open to how other Christians might approach the same issues.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name is Derry.
And guys, thank you for coming back. We have an exciting show today, but first, we want to talk about our social media, our Patreon, where you can find us. We have a TikTok, Instagram. Those are both Things You Don't Hear in Church. And then on YouTube, it's TYDHC Media. And then we also have Patreon. All the links below if you want to support or find us on socials.
Yeah. Leave a review, like, subscribe, all that good stuff that you know about. Yeah. Cool. So we've got an awesome episode today. One I'm really looking forward to personally. We've got a special guest, Randal Rauser, aka the Tentative Apologist. I've been following his work for maybe 2 years now, maybe a year and a half, something like that. He's a seminary professor. He's a doctor, a theologian, an author, a YouTuber. He's pretty active on Twitter as well. He does a lot of different things. He's got a lot of awesome books that we also would love to recommend. Randal, is there anything that you want to plug as we start?
Well, I mean, my most recent book, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, came out in April, but I actually have another one coming out probably end of November, which is called Christian Bellows, and it's a satire of conservative or fundamentalist apologetics. So it's a different kind of thing.
I saw that. I'm really excited to see what that one's like myself. And you had one about the Canaanite genocide as well, yeah?
Yeah, that was last year. Yeah. So I've got this one that's coming out now will be my 15th book. So I've got a few on different topics.
Wow. What do you think has been your favorite book that you've written so far?
I don't know I couldn't answer that. I mean, it's kind of like whatever the one that you're just finishing is the one you're most excited about generally. But I think in terms of probably scholarship, the Jesus Loves Canaanites that came out last year would be the one. And I did one years ago with Oxford University Press. So from an academic perspective, that one also I'm quite proud of. I did one on my autobiography called What's So Confusing About Grace. That was probably my most personal book. Wow. So, right, it's kind of like asking which of your kids do you like best?
Right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you said this newest book is one that you've never really written about before, a satire.
Well, I've certainly done things in satire before, but this new one, when it comes out, so it's the character Christian Bellows I invented is like a fundamentalist apologist in the Midwest. Of course, the name's a double entendre, expressing both his perspective and approach to life. And I grew up as what is sometimes called a fundagelical, or a Christian community that has aspects of fundamentalism and conservative evangelicalism that tend to blur together. So I understand that perspective quite well, and having been doing apologetics for 30 years, I'm also very familiar with how it impacts apologetics. So I thought I'd have some fun doing a satire, which is, a social commentary, critical commentary through humor and irony, talking about fundamentalism and apologetics.
Cool.
So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. So what is your primary area of focus when it comes to maybe ministry or work, or at least in the scholarly realm? Like, is there a certain subject that you like to talk about the most? I assume apologetics is like one of those, but outside of that, is there a specific area?
Well, apologetics, of course, is a huge thing. So it encompasses many different issues. I would say, first of all, like I was deeply impacted by Alvin Plantinga. He's a Christian philosopher, and his approach to apologetics, which is very much my approach, has less of a focus upon the development of positive arguments for theism or Christianity, and tends to have more of an approach on responding to defeaters or objections to Christianity, having also offered a general defense of the rationality of Christianity. So that's more my approach. It's less kind of focusing upon classic arguments for Christianity, and instead looking at responding to objections and defending the overall plausibility of Christianity, and that's long been a passion of mine. So whether it comes to addressing issues of anti-intellectualism within the faith, some of the things I think we might talk about later, I think a healthier understanding of what mere Christianity is, what the role of doubt in the Christian life is, how to understand things like biblical violence, that's really been more my wheelhouse than conventional arguments for the existence of God or for the historical resurrection of Jesus, which of course are important topics as well, but have not been primarily in the center of my focus.
Wow. Cool. Well, let's get into our show today.
Yeah.
And we really want to talk about, we're doing a 2-part episode, one with Randall and hopefully one with Dan Lewis coming on in a couple of weeks. They'll probably be spaced out by about a month. We'll see.
Yeah, a month, maybe 2. Dan is a hard man to nail down.
So we want to do like kind of an intro to what scholarship is for our listeners, and then sort of the differences between different scholarly views, and especially how the church views scholarship, so we can get a correct understanding of what it is, how to use it as a good tool, right? So that's why we're having Randall on today. And to intro the topic a little bit, I feel like more and more today, either as scholars start to have social media platforms, start to be more of influencers, stuff like that, just become more popularized in their work. It used to be hard that like Christians couldn't really find scholarly work, and if we did, it might be a little more confusing to us. But with the growing amount of information that's on the internet, we've stopped going to our pastors as much just for a one-stop shop for all of our theology, and we've started looking online to see what the scholarly consensus is. Or maybe not the scholarly consensus, but what this scholar says and what this scholar says. And as that's become very popular, especially on TikTok and YouTube, you've seen lay Christians everywhere start to change a lot of their opinions about what the Bible is. On inerrancy, on issues like biblical violence, stuff like that. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what that landscape is like of scholarship. How should we view scholars as Christians? Because I think we, at least in the landscape, in my opinion, Christians are kind of landing in 2 camps right now. You'll see scholarship, and a Christian could be challenged on something they have just held as a fundamental, like verbal plenary inspiration or inerrancy, right? Yeah. And they're challenged on that, and they think, okay, this is what all liberal scholars believe. I'm going to reject liberal scholarship. I'm going to go with like these few conservative scholars, right? This is what I've heard a lot on the internet. That's kind of one perspective that I see a lot of people taking. Another one would be, okay, I'm going to go with the broad scope of what scholars say in general, not just like the Christian ones. And I'm going to reject inerrancy, kind of accept more of a relativistic view of the Bible, and still try to maintain some semblance of being a Christian. We have a lot of friends genuinely that accept that view as well. So we wanted to get a better rounded view than just what's happening within our friend group, within the internet and the social media that we, I guess, live on. And hear from your perspective, Randall, about scholarship in general, how we should treat it, how the church should understand it, and even for us. I know I'm talking a lot, but even for us, like, there is sort of this idea that there's like these 2 camps, like conservative versus like liberal scholarship, and I don't think that's exactly how it should be understood as well. So yeah, is there anything you have to say about that?
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
Someone like the Apostle Paul, right? He studied under Gamaliel, one of the leading scholars of his day. So right there you have, right at the foundation of Christianity, somebody who was very much a scholar of his day. When Paul in Acts 17 goes to Athens, he goes straight to Mars Hill and he engages critically in debate with the leading scholars of his day there from outside his community, Stoic philosophers primarily. He didn't really engage with the Epicureans as much, actually quoting from the Stoic philosophers at a high level their own sources approvingly, which is an interesting thing I think we often miss. Just as an aside, like I've because I've done a fair amount on defending aspects of progressive Christianity recently, and some conservative evangelicals, for example, they freak out because a progressive Christian, quote unquote, like Richard Rohr. Like I just say quote unquote because we have to be careful about these labels.
Absolutely.
Because often they use to sort of shelve a person, categorize them, put them on. We know where you're coming from. Anyway, so Richard Rohr would quote someone like the Dalai Lama approvingly. And so then here some conservatives freak out that he's blurring Christianity with syncretizing it, combining it with other religious systems, when really what he's doing, I think, is no different than what Paul does when he quotes from the Stoic philosophers and says, in him we live and move and have our being. He's finding that all truth is God's truth. So you have that aspect of Christianity back to the foundations. You have Christians who are intellectual and highly engaged in the world around them. You had others who were fishermen, right, and did not have a highly educated background. Although if Peter wrote First Peter, for example, then clearly he did have some learning from when he was a fisherman to when he wrote that letter, because that letter is written at a fairly high level in terms of the Greek. The point, however, is that Christianity is a diverse community, and it's always had these different aspects. And so then you have different traditions. So you have traditions that seek throughout history to have a positive engagement with the world around them, and like Paul did at Mars Hill, to find aspects of the wider culture that they can affirm. So you have someone like St. Augustine, for example, in the 4th and 5th century, who's trying to combine Christianity with late Platonism, which was the main philosophical view of his day. You have someone like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who's trying to bring Christianity into dialogue with Aristotelianism, which was the philosophy of his day. And by philosophy, we shouldn't just think narrowly as philosophy as we understand it today, but also something that encompasses things like natural science, because that's what philosophy was, right? Back in the prior to the 17th century, natural philosophy was an aspect of, that's what we call today's science, was an aspect of the philosophical disciplines. So then you have today, scholars are trying to do the same thing, right? There are some of them that are trying to positively interact with, engage, and assess the intellectual learning around them and bring Christianity into dialogue with that. And that's part of this very long, noble tradition that you find in Aquinas, you find it in Augustine, you find it back in Paul. Now, conservative evangelicalism, which is the tribe that I grew up in and came out of, has typically been more skeptical of that, and has frankly a long history of anti-intellectualism and suspicion about scholarship and academia. Not entirely unwarranted, by the way, because there are aspects that scholarship is never a neutral enterprise. It's always framed by the culture in which it is done, with the particular interest and assumptions of that culture. And sometimes those assumptions are not neutral. Well, they're rarely neutral, but they can be hostile to Christian perspectives. And so you should be aware of that and critically engaging with it. Unfortunately, sometimes from this conservative perspective, it was to simply withdraw from the culture. So as a summary of that, you have a very well-known book, came out, it's hard to believe, but almost 30 years ago, by Mark Knoll, a historian, called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he provides a general survey and critique of evangelicalism and its traditional skepticism about the academy and scholarship. So so that's where I've come out of, but I'm also much more generally these days sympathetic with the other first tradition I talked about, which is more of a critical engagement. And that's a very quick 2 cents in response to your initial question.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's a good, I think, intro to what scholarship is, definitely. You said that a lot of scholars will come to their profession, you didn't say the word bias, but with sort of assumptions or things they're trying to do. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Presuppositions, these are things that you typically assume in advance, and they frame your inquiry, the way you think about the topic, the question. And some presuppositions can be biases, right? Because they're going to predispose you to engaging with data in a particular way rather than another way. And so you find presuppositions. I think here's an example, is that sometimes presuppositions can be informed by something like naturalism. Whereas naturalism, although naturalism is a very broad and much disputed concept, but nonetheless, if we were to say naturalism is something like this, it's something like being skeptical of or delegitimating supernatural explanations of the world around us, and only seeking natural explanations or privileging natural explanations. Well, the privileging of natural explanations, I think, is not in and of itself a bad thing. Because I think most cases when we misplace our keys, or we can't find our keys, I should say, we assume we misplaced them. In other words, we look for a natural explanation. We don't assume that a ghost hid the keys or that a demon hid the keys. But at some point, we should be open to a supernatural explanation. But there are some people coming from a naturalistic perspective that think you should never consider a supernatural explanation, that a natural explanation is always preferable. So where this really becomes an issue is, let's say that you're looking at the historical evidence for whether Jesus rose from the dead. There are some people who will always prefer a natural explanation of the evidence. So some of the evidence we have is that the apostles, they believed that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. The tomb was empty, and they began to proclaim that he had risen from the dead in order to, redeem people having died for their sins, things like that. And so you have to explain that data. What changes people's minds? I mentioned Paul. He was an early persecutor of the church. Something changed his mind. What changed his mind? One possibility is a supernatural explanation. Jesus did rise from the dead. Jesus did appear to Paul on the road to Damascus. Or you could say, what are the natural explanations? Now, if a person is never open to a supernatural explanation, that's going to shape their scholarship, right? And they're going to end up producing scholarship that's very skeptical. And so I think as a Christian, we should be aware of those kind of biases and the way that they can frame the way that people approach their scholarship. But it can also go the other way. So, for example, I mentioned earlier about Peter writing 1 Peter. Most scholars today, and I'm sure we'll get into topics like this in terms of scholarly consensus, but most scholars today believe that Peter did not write 2 Peter. What they would do then is they would categorize 2 Peter as pseudepigraphic, which means somebody else wrote it and it was falsely attributed to Peter. Now, there are good reasons to believe that 2 Peter was not written by Peter. Well, at least let me put it this way: there are reasons that very reasonable, intelligent people have that they will give you as to why they don't believe Peter wrote 2 Peter. But a Christian can have a bias saying let's say it would be lying if God allowed pseudepigraphy into the Bible, and so it must be that 2 Peter was written by Peter. That also is a presupposition that's going to frame the way you interact with something, and maybe that one's not neutral either, right? So whether you are the naturalist who's skeptical of the miracle, or you're the evangelical Christian who's critical of 2 Peter possibly being pseudepigraphic, in each case, we're going to have assumptions that are going to form how we do our scholarship. And so the best thing we can do is to be aware of what those assumptions are and how they are framing our scholarship, not least because that's going to help us in our conversations with people with whom we disagree, because we can understand that they're coming from a different starting point.
I know I've heard many times from listening to scholars that these biases don't affect their work, because every scholar along every religion and every background is trying to have the same non-biased opinion when they go into scholarship and just look at the numbers, right? And just tell you what the numbers say. What would you say if someone said that to you? They're like, we don't have biases, like we just look at the numbers.
That would be a pretty naive view, I think. Now, it does depend upon the field, right? Mathematics is something, but English literature is something else. I don't know if you guys ever watched Dead Poets Society, or if that's before your time.
Love that movie.
Yeah, have you seen it?
I love it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so there you have the teacher comes to the private school. What's his name, Mr. Played by Robin Williams.
Yeah,
anyway,
I
so
forget
he's
his
the
name.
dynamic,
Captain.
Dynamic teacher. Captain, my captain. So he comes and he's teaching the class, and then he has them take the textbook. And at the beginning of the textbook, he looks at the essay that introduces English literature, and the person who wrote the introduction to this collection of great English literature, poems and short prose and so on. He says that, it's actually just poems, I think. He says you need to have this scientific way to chart the value of the poem. And so you draw a graph on a paper, and you're going to measure these different attributes of the poem so that you have a scientific account at the end in terms of the quality of the poem. Mr. Keating, that's his name. So then Mr. Keating says, rip that out of the book. And all the kids kind of shocked, and then they end up getting excited and they rip out this essay because he says, that's not poem. He says, you're not... laying concrete or something. He's like, you're not doing some mundane task. Poetry is not amenable to that kind of precision. It's a different kind of thing. And if you try to insist that poetry must be amenable to scientific measurement, you're going to destroy the poetry in the process. And I think that that's a good reminder, is that each type of inquiry is different, and you have to accept it on its own terms. Theology is very different from mathematics. And presuppositions, assumptions about the nature of the world, about the nature of knowledge, about the nature of the good, about who we are as human beings, what our problem is, those assumptions are all going to inform our theology, our philosophy, issues in the humanities that I deal with every day, in a way that they may not immediately do so in mathematics. So you definitely have to be aware of those presuppositions, because they undoubtedly are affecting how you approach the subject matter.
Yeah, so with all those different types of scholarship, some being more given to skepticism, some giving more to finding supernatural means, what is like, how does the lay Christian sort through all that, and at what point do they look at a scholar and say, oh, they're too skeptical, or look at another scholar and say, oh, they're not skeptical enough? And like, how do we kind of sift through all the scholarly stuff? Because even like, and there's even like all the non-scholarly or non-Christian scholars, like how do Christians relate with non-Christian scholars, and like what does our relationship to that look like, in finding good scholarship that we can rely on, where it's not going to try to. So like, for instance, like you said, presuppositions. If someone's not a Christian, they're doing scholarly research, they're going to be more skeptical about the resurrection, like we established. So I would think, like, how much of that scholar should a Christian then trust and then rely on for their study?
Yeah, these are just such, they're big questions. The first thing I would want to say is that we have to be careful about a mentality that thinks I'm only going to read or listen to people that I agree with. Because even if you think a person has certain things wrong, they undoubtedly have other things right. And even in the things that they have wrong, you can learn from them, not least in the old iron sharpens iron adage of finding out how other people think and then exploring ways to respond to the way they think. So someone like Bart Ehrman, for example, is a New Testament scholar and one of the leading popularizers of scholarship and biblical and New Testament scholarship in the world today. And he's an agnostic. And as an agnostic, you're going to get challenged by him time and again in his writings. But I think also, like he wrote, for example, I talked about 2 Peter being pseudepigraphic. He wrote a book called Forged, where he explores the whole problem of pseudepigraphy in biblical documents. And it's the kind of approach and conversation that you're just not going to get from an evangelical. So if you only expose yourself to evangelicals, then you're not going to have as wide and deep an understanding of the issues. So there's a lot of value in that. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is, I think with the hyperpolarization that we have today on things like social media, and particularly things like COVID-19 or climate change, what you have is people, often I think lay people, who are adopting very extreme views relative to the wide consensus of scholarship on a position. And they can say, yeah, but I can quote this scholar who believes X, whatever it is. And the thing is, we always have to keep in mind is, I'm going to propose to you guys a principle that all things being equal, or all other things being equal, you ought to defer to a consensus of scholarship when that consensus exists, unless you have some overriding reason not to do so. So, for example, how do you define a consensus? I think probably generally about 90% plus of scholars, if 90% plus of people who have terminal degrees in the relevant field of expertise, because we have to be careful how we're defining scholars. If we have about 90% of people with terminal degrees in the relevant field of expertise who hold the same view on a particular position, it's safe to say the consensus exists. And in that case, what that means, let's say the issue is human-induced climate change. And if 90+% of climatologists believe that there's human-induced climate change that poses a serious risk to human flourishing on the earth, then you can find the 1, 2, 3, 4 scholars out there who are climatologists who reject that consensus, but because the consensus exists, I would submit that you have the onus is on you to show why the minority have such overwhelming arguments to overtake the majority. And I think typically what you have here are people are engaging in things like special pleading when they side with the one guy, a scholar who's charismatic and has a YouTube channel, but he dismisses the scholarship of 97% of experts in the field. So it's just for me a caution.
Very interesting. You were talking.
It's the same thing. Then I would apply that just to say to biblical scholarship as well. So, for example, I'm not a biblical scholar, but most biblical scholars do not believe Moses wrote the Torah. Most of them believe that large tracts of the Torah and the Deuteronomic history were compiled centuries after the life of Moses. So if that is the case, then that would put you on. It doesn't mean you can't believe Moses wrote the Torah. Or to take another example, creation was made in 6 days. But it does mean that it does put you on, in a sense, the defensive, is to really consider the arguments of the majority or the consensus, and then consider good rebuttals to them before you kind of just go down the path of following the one siloed voice that's differing with the majority.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. How would one, just like a layperson like ourselves, how do you find out what the consensus of scholars is? Because I feel like this is a term, especially on TikTok, that gets thrown around like a dead body all the time. Like,
People throw
well,
dead bodies?
the scholarly consensus is this. And then the other person will just clap back with the exact same thing. And you're like, well, how are we supposed to figure that out? It's just used as a weapon all the time.
That's a great question. And I don't have a simple answer. I'm thinking about this in terms of philosophy. For example, some years ago, a philosopher named David Chalmers did an extensive sociological survey of the opinions of philosophers. And he surveyed philosophers at how many believe God exists and things like that, how many have a particular view of a philosophical issue like mind-body dualism. And based upon that kind of solid data, you can now say, well, most experts believe this. But even that, like, you have to be cautious on an issue like that, because let's say that 90% of philosophers are mind-body dualists, but only 10% of those philosophers are specialists in the mind-body problem. Most of them haven't actually thought a lot about it since graduate school. Well, then it's not necessarily that their opinions are relevant. They may have a terminal degree in philosophy, but maybe not in the relevant specialization. And it's no less true when you get into areas like science and so on. For me, I'm kind of one thing I look, let's say COVID-19 or something like that, and whether you should take a vaccine that's been approved by the government. One thing I do is, as a rough and ready principle, I kind of look to all the main institutional bodies that are considered expert bodies of opinion on the issue. So the World Health Organization, the National Institute of Health, Health Canada within Canada here where I live, etc. And then relevant, like the American Pediatric Foundation and so on. And I have looked at these, and so they've all issued statements on the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And I don't have survey data, but if I don't have survey data, but I can see what the consensus official opinions are coming from the main bodies that represent expert opinion, that nonetheless, I think gives me a rough and ready basis on which to form an opinion. Certainly more reliable than a self-selected group of people that may have terminal degrees, but happen to be on TikTok or YouTube and have got your attention. It's going to be more reliable, all other things being equal, to go with expert scientific bodies, and the same thing in other fields of inquiry as well.
Well, for earlier you had said we don't want to just find opinions we already agree with and consume that information. I think that's a true statement. That's not good for any scope of reality. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do it with politics. You shouldn't do it with the Bible, or you shouldn't do it with really any topic. But when it comes to certain more specific differences, in my opinion, like if there is a scholar who's not a Christian, sometimes I wonder, at what point, or at some point, why engage with people who aren't Christians about the Bible if the Bible is supposed to inform my life and I have a spiritual worldview and I hold to the Bible? At what, in my mind, I always wonder, well, why should I take these guys Like, or how seriously should I take these guys if they don't even believe God is real or that Jesus is God? Because then it seems like that is the starting base of all Christianity. And if they don't hold that, then and sometimes I question like, oh, what else are they getting wrong? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so what I would one thing I would say is, so let's say this person you're referring to, let's say their specialization is the letter of Romans, and some, of course, that biblical scholars, like in any field, they can really get specialized. So, I don't know how specialized to go, but let's say like some specific aspect of Romans, some specific verse, some word Paul is using in his argument, something like that, or the authorship of Romans, textual critical issues, things like that. In that case, where you can benefit from that person is not on their beliefs about God or Jesus, but on this specialization of theirs. Always, again, attentive to the degree to which their views about ultimate reality can impact their scholarship. But nonetheless, there can be enormous benefit in the scholarship that people produce. We have to be, again, like the danger of a sort of purity test is like, you have to agree with me in all these big things before I can benefit from anything you have to say, would certainly be a mistake. I don't know who originally said the principle, all truth is God's truth, but it's famously associated with Arthur Holmes, the 20th century philosopher. It's a very simple principle, but one to, I think, we are well reminded of. So whether or not a person confesses to be Christianity, again, like Bart Ehrman, nonetheless, they can be producing all sorts of very helpful insights for us. And let me just give you one other illustration that some years ago, so I wrote a book called Finding God in the Shack, and it was about that novel, The Shack, which was popular some years ago. And so one of the objections I heard to The Shack at the time was, you can call it the poop in the cake objection. So what people would say was like, okay, but maybe there's a lot of good things in the shack, but if you take a little bit of poop and you mix it into the cake batter, you're not going to want to eat any of the cake. And so that, again, that creates that purity mentality that unless I agree with everything that this person espouses or everything in the scholarship or the work that they produced, I shouldn't partake of any of it because it's all tainted. But I think that's just a flawed metaphor. And I actually shared that metaphor some years ago when I was doing a speaking tour on the book on a radio show. And then the interviewer was a Southerner, and he says, Professor, I don't think it's like a chocolate cake. I think it's like fried chicken. You eat your chicken and you leave the bone. And I thought, that's exactly right. It's like when you're reading Bart Ehrman, you eat the chicken and you leave the bone. And you're going to find bones in any scholarship that anybody produces, because none of us bats 1,000, right? We're all getting things wrong. We're all fallible. We all see darkly as through a glass. And so it's just a matter of being critical and discerning.
Right. So two things with that, then. It seems like if someone's going to say, if there's a little bit of poop, you don't eat the whole cake, then the question is like, okay, then are you saying that we have to be right in everything, or right in what you think is right in everything before you take it seriously? And then the question I would propose to that person would be like, is there anything that you're wrong in? Because now it seems like you're saying that if you're wrong in anything, you are wrong in everything. Does that make sense? And then I just don't think that's a helpful view. I think the chicken in the bone makes a lot more sense because, everyone's wrong. And then with that in mind, then how do we? This is the heart of the question. It's like, how do we know what the bones are when we're looking at different scholars? Like, how do we find that out? Because it can't be just because we disagree with it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we have to keep in mind is I don't think we've explicitly mentioned it yet, is epistemic humility. So that just refers to, I think, a simple idea is to recognize that we don't know what we don't know, first of all, and we're not experts in everything. But it seems like these days, a lot of people, you often encounter this attitude online. Well, I read an article on Wikipedia about that, and then you'll see that guy engaging with a scholar online who has this been their life's work for 20 years, but he wrote a Wikipedia article, and the thing is, the second you kind of say you're not equal, actually, you should be quiet and listen to the scholar who's been working on this for 20 years. The second you say that, you sound like an elitist jerk. But it's true.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think we all have to learn, I certainly have to learn it, is when I need to be quiet and when I just kind of need to listen to other people and kind of really grapple with what they're saying. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of engaging the scholars, if we're not scholars ourselves in the field, we're probably not going to be engaging with what they've done at the level at which they've done it. And what that's going to require us then is that we're probably going to be looking for other people who can be guides for us. And so the other thing I think, in addition to epistemic humility, we have to look for is wisdom as we seek to discern who the guides are, who the people we are going to trust.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be skeptical of COVID-19 vaccines and you're going to go with that, maybe it is true. Every once in a while, the conspiracy is correct, right? And so maybe the guy that you've put all your trust in YouTube, who's making those videos, maybe he is correct and all these other people are incorrect. The thing to recognize is that you have placed your trust in him. And we're going to do that. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, so some of the things when I'm going to critique Bart Ehrman, they're going to be heavily dependent upon people who know way more about that than I do. And that's true for everybody. So I would say the epistemic humility, and then having wisdom and discernment and selecting the sources that we are going to trust as guides for the scholarship.
How would you say that we should find those guides? Because earlier we were talking about the scholarly consensus of things, and you again just touched on you got to find those pillars that you can kind of trust in. That if you can't know, we have a survey and this is the scholarly consensus, you got to find those cultural or societal pillars to trust in. How can we find those within Christian scholarship for the Bible and stuff like that? Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like if I'm looking for which restaurant am I going to go out to. Some things you look for is you go online, for example, and you see what the Google reviews are or reviews on Yelp and so on. And you're gonna recognize that there's gonna be probably some of the top reviews and the 1-star reviews you want to screen out and kind of get the general consensus of what most people are saying about that restaurant. And if you've got a wet restaurant with 1,400 reviews and it's coming in at 4.7 on Google reviews or Yelp out of 5, all things being equal, that's kind of a good sign. So I would begin by using things like that. What are people saying about this person? It's pretty easy to get a sense. So, for example, if you're evaluating a book, well, if the book is really popular and then you look down and it's let's say it's published by a well-respected publisher and there's 9 people giving endorsements to it who you respect or who all have good reputations, and perhaps even a diversity of perspectives. They're not all from one religious subculture, right? But across a broader field of scholarship. And then you can go online easily and find some reviews and you find it's getting great buzz, it's got great reviews. I mean, things like that. It's just a very simple way to begin to gather information about whether something is worth reading, much as you decide whether to go to a restaurant.
I think that's so good. I think for myself, it was just the realization that, and what you described, it takes work to find out what these things are. And a lot of times we don't want to do that work. You might have to read a lot of books to find out the answer. And reading a lot of books takes a lot of time. And really we want to just Google, what is the scholarly consensus on this thing? And it's we like to do that for a lot of things. And some things it's easier to do than others. Like you talked about, it just takes a lot of work for stuff like that.
Right. So what are some sources that are available where you could find scholarly journals or articles? Because I know there's a number, I found different journals at times. I'm oh, this is fun, and I go to do it and it's oh, you have to be a member of this university or you have to pay X amount of money for the. Are there good free resources that are out there for the everyday person who doesn't want to spend most of their life reading this stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I would say that to start off as a very good general access tool would be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a public access website with encyclopedic entries for a growing list of topics, and they've been compiling it for the last 20 years. And the key is that leading scholars, leading philosophers in the field do the entries in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And so you know that it's peer-reviewed and vetted. So I would that would be one place I would start. This sounds, in a sense, kind of almost embarrassing to say, but Wikipedia is a starting point. There was an interesting study done of Wikipedia comparing the public resourced articles in Wikipedia to medical journal articles. And in some cases, and I can't give you the source, so this is anecdotal. I probably shouldn't even share it. But it was from one of these, a leading medical journal, like the Journal of the American Medical Association or something like that. And they showed that Wikipedia articles were surprisingly accurate when it came to medical information because of the fact they're constantly being checked and vetted by people and so on. And you actually, I mean, there's just something to say for human nature that you don't get as many people maybe like coming in and putting in malicious information or false information as you might expect. Now, it does get, when you have something like, an entry on AstraZeneca vaccine or something, well, then it's going to become much more controversial because there are different people that are fighting over that. But if you're like, oh, I'm going to look up oncology or something on Wikipedia, you actually can get some pretty good information, and it's a starting point. And one thing it does is it gives you a working biography or bibliography, I should say, on the bottom from which to work. So now I always tell my students, I don't ever want to see Wikipedia in your footnotes. But if that's the first place you want to go before you go on and get the stuff you're actually going to cite in your paper, then that would be a legitimate one. You put me on the spot here a little bit, to be honest. But hold on, give me 1 second, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating.
Yeah, because I think it's important to know, like, we don't want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to scholarship. There's a lot of things that in scholarship, as they come to light, are new for most Christians, so it's good to have this conversation to kind of challenge our views, but also accept what scholarship is saying, because like you were saying, 10 years ago, even like maybe 5 years ago, the wealth of information wasn't as known. Now we have so much more access, which kind of then I would say the expectation almost for pastors to also know this and respond and have some formulated thoughts is probably higher than it was before, because now their normal congregate member can be like, you said this thing that Moses wrote this, but actually there's most of the scholarship that says you're wrong. So if you're not even willing to recognize this simple like scholarly resource, what else in your teaching are you not necessarily challenging?
Yeah.
So a couple other things I'll just add is, so the Journal of Analytic Theology is public access, but I just can't get the URL right now. But if people were to Google that, that's a great resource. Awesome. Here's something to keep in mind: Google Scholar. There's a lot that you can get on Google Scholar that's public access, and sometimes if you want to read, you can get sort of, as you know, on Amazon Books, you can get portions of the book that you can read. And also on Google Books search, if you do a Google Book search, you can get different things often than you can get. So sometimes if I can't access a book, I've read portions of it on, let's say on Amazon, you got a limited preview and you can't read after page 67, but then I went over to Google Books and found it from page 68 on. Now, you shouldn't do that with my books. You should only buy my books. But if you can't access other books, that's just a way to begin to get into the actual books themselves. So yeah, I would just say things like that. Like, there are a lot of resources available online. But always like kind of look, where are things, who published it? Is it a reputable publisher? Now, I've been publishing my last 4 books. I publish all my more recent books under my own imprint. But I've published with Edinburgh University Press, Oxford University Press before and stuff. So I'm okay saying I'm still a reputable scholar. But if you find someone online and they've got a self-published book, take it with a grain of salt unless you have some independent reason to believe they're a trusted resource. Other than that, you want to be looking for good publishers.
Right.
Now, and again, not just Christian publishers, but other publishers as well, for sure.
When it comes to that consensus again of scholars and how Christians, at least like in our circles of evangelicalism, tend to be more skeptical of mainline scholarship and just go with like traditional scholarship. How did you and how can we like be less skeptical of that mainline scholarship and accepting to where we don't view it as like poop and cake, but we like want to get the actual like good chicken out of that bone, you know what I mean?
It's like such a mature conversation when we're throwing out the word poop.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Well, I think one thing to recognize is that evangelicalism is not the end all be all. Right? It's one cul-de-sac in Christianity or one branch. It's like how many indigenous peoples throughout history, the name they had for themselves was translated as the people, right? And then everybody else is like something away from the people. That's just human nature. And so when it comes to growing up evangelical, tended to think of evangelical as just the Christian, right? And then anything that's not that, you're Catholic, you're a mainline Presbyterian or Lutheran or Methodist or something else, you're suspect. And it's just not that. So when you recognize, for example, like I was speaking recently with a student who they grew up in a conservative dispensational household, which I did as well. They didn't understand that dispensational theology only arose in the late 19th century when it was developed by a fellow named John Darby and then was brought over to North America and is unknown to the vast majority of Christians throughout history. But I grew up thinking that's just what Christianity is. It's dispensationalism. And so when you begin to have that self-awareness of the limitations of your perspective, that can hopefully frame it. So when you have things like a particular understanding of inerrancy or biblical authority or how to interpret Genesis, you have this principle is very influential among conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists. It's called the literal principle or the literal where possible principle. And what it does is it treats the interpretation of the passage that is literal as the default interpretation in the Bible. So, for example, you ought to interpret creation in 6 days as a literal 6 days unless you have some very good reason not to do so. Now, that is a very common principle, one that I grew up with. And so we defaulted to young earth creationism. When you recognize that that's actually a highly questionable hermeneutical principle, one that I think naively assumes that what seems, first of all, it naively assumes that what seems to be obviously a certain way of reading for me would be the same way that someone 2,000 or 3,000 years ago read that same passage in another language and culture. That's enormously presumptuous. The other thing that's presumptuous is the assumption that literal quote-unquote reading should be the default reading. If you look at how highly idiomatic our language is, how richly saturated it is with metaphor, such as using the language of saturation as a way of describing language, right? It's in terms of moisture, soaking something, right? So that's actually not literal. That's a use of idiom, saturation in language. Now you recognize, okay, that principle is not so neutral after all, and you can begin to question it.
That's good.
And so as you begin to question the assumptions that these again, they were your presuppositions, you work from them, but you recognize that maybe they're flawed, but they're definitely historically conditioned. Then you can become more aware of that and more open to how other Christians might approach the same issues.
That's so good. And like, yeah, I really like that. And then the idea that, well, do you have I have a question that might take us somewhere else. So I want to make sure that
yeah.
relevant.
Just as we're on the topic of consensus and different forms of scholarship, real quick, if you want to, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but since you said you came from sort of that fundamentalist background and now you've moved to a tradition you think is more respectable and sort of consuming all of this scholarship, is there, or do you want to share with us maybe a place within the Bible or that realm of theology where you disagree with this consensus, and then one where you would agree with the consensus apart from maybe what a fundamentalist would believe? Does that question make sense to you?
Well, I mean, there are.
I can give an example if you need me to.
Well, I mean, I can say, for example, I grew up holding to eternal conscious torment, which is the majority view in the Christian tradition, that posthumous judgment for those outside Christ is that they will be resurrected to a suffering of torture forever in body and soul. And I came in the 1990s to reject that view and to hold an annihilationist view that people would be resurrected to a judgment that results in the cessation of their existence. It's a minority view in the church. So that would be an example, I think, of now in terms of. So I mean, if you're talking about experts here, yeah, most Christians, theologians who've looked at the issue have held to eternal conscious torment. I don't. Now, I also, when it comes to the issue of biblical violence, so I take a more critical and skeptical approach to how much history we can extrapolate from the Deuteronomic story, and also I'm quite intentional in drawing upon ethical intuitions when I interpret Scripture and do theology, and I argue that carefully over 300 some pages. But that would be a perspective where I would. Now, I will say this, there's a lot more diversity in how to interpret things like the killing of the Canaanites in Christian tradition than most evangelicals recognize. But nonetheless, I do take what would be, I think, a minority view on that issue. So there would be issues like that where I've taken minority perspectives. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
The question I was going to ask was, with the reality that like Darby brought in dispensationalists like less than maybe around 100 years ago, or is it 200 years? You said 19th century or 1900s?
So about 1860s,
okay, so 19th
1860s or so.
Yeah. So about 200-ish years ago, around that, 250, that was brought in. Also, the mainly futurist view of Revelation also was brought in by Darby. When it comes to stuff like this, and like new, I want to make a distinction between like new theology and like the scholarly work, because the more we uncover in history, the more we can understand how to read the Bible, which is like the good scholarly stuff. So maybe the new is better. But when it comes to theological views like dispensational or futurist, when they're very new views, should they be questioned because they're new, or should we take them like, oh, because maybe it's new, it's correct? Because I feel like maybe a lot of people went that way in dispensationalism or went that way in futuristic view of Revelation, because it was new, so therefore it seemed right, and it's like, oh, we thought this, but now we actually are going to think this. So when it comes to new developments in theological thought, how quickly should we be to adopt the new if it disagrees with most of church history? Does that make sense?
I mean, this is when I talked about a consensus, and if there's a consensus that exists of 90% plus, all things being equal, the starting point is to defer to consensus unless you have some good reason not to. And I think that's fair to say in terms of the history of Christianity as well. I hope I'm not proof texting when I appeal to John 16:13, where Jesus says the Spirit will lead you in all truth. I think it's fair to extrapolate, at least in the fuller sense of what he's saying there, is that the Holy Spirit will lead the followers of Christ into deeper theological understanding over time. And with that in mind, if you have some position that is just coming out now and it's becoming popular now, but has never been countenanced by Christians before throughout church history, I think all things being equal, you ought to be quite skeptical of that view. Now, you still have to judge the view on its merits. And it could be that view ultimately is vindicated and wins the day. But if it hasn't been seriously countenanced for 2,000 years, I think we ought to be somewhat skeptical of it. And now some of the positions I take are positions that have been minority voices throughout church tradition. That's a little different and less extreme than having a position that just came out of nowhere now. What I certainly wouldn't do is take that kind of position you described of chronological snobbery, that C.S. Lewis would have called it, where because something is new, it must be better. I think that would be a pretty naive view to take.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
This has been really informative. And as we come to the end of our show, we're around 53 minutes right now. One, thank you for coming on and having such a great conversation. This has been amazing.
A pleasure, yeah.
And second, for our last question, we started doing this maybe
5 episodes ago.
At this point, a month ago, where we started asking our guests, the last question is, what was one of the most challenging or hardest questions you faced in your Christian journey? And how did you answer it and still be a Christian? Because a lot of our listeners are maybe the demographic of people going through deconstruction or challenging presuppositions they grew up with. and they have these hard questions about Christianity that they want to answer. So we think it's really helpful when our guests who have been Christians for X amount of years, have a lot more life experience and struggled with these questions, and still follow Jesus, to shed light on that topic.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, those issues are going to be issues related broadly to the problem of evil and suffering in the world. So, for example, for me, what was along the most difficult issue, or certainly up there, is just how much violence and blood there is in the Bible, and how much of it is commanded and commended by God within the narrative. And that's what compelled me to write a book that takes those issues on directly and looks for how to understand that. When you have something like the Canaanites seemingly under divine command carrying out the mass slaughter of civilian populations in a way that meets the contemporary legal definition of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and where in any other circumstance, if we saw events unfolding which met the legal definition of genocide and ethnic cleansing, we would say those are moral atrocities, they must be stopped at any cost. How do we now say, yeah, but in this case, God did it? And so I think what sometimes happens is that Christians end up kind of backing into sort of moral relativist position, where they're kind of saying, well, it was good then, but it's always evil now, which they would never do when it comes to something like rape.
Right.
You would never say, well, rape was okay for a particular period in history, but it's good now. And yet we could say that when it comes to killing infants, bludgeoning infants to death and things like that. So that's why I wrote that book. And I would say that it has, for me, satisfactorily addressed the issue as I came out of that. But nonetheless, I ended that book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, by talking about, for me, the biggest remaining issue here is that kind of flows out of that is the problem of ambiguity within the text. And I give, for example, hope I'm not running on too long here, but indulge me for a couple minutes. So there's this, I give an example in the book. There's this group called Insane Clown Posse, and they're not on my top list of musical acts, but they're kind of famous for being like a horrorcore, rap, hip hop, something like that.
Yes.
And for years they had they're known for their very violent, misogynistic lyrics, and glorifying violence and drugs and other things like that. And then about 10, 12 years ago, they came out and they said, it's just two guys in this group, and they said actually all of that was meant to be ironic. We didn't mean that literally, and we actually follow God. And what we want to do is show that the life, self-destructive life, it only leads to sadness and so on.
Wow.
Now the problem with that was, and I don't know that people are to this day like entirely sure whether they're up and up about that, because for one thing, you had for 20 years they had a fan base called the Gigolos, who were considered to be a gang by the FBI because they were so violent, and they would go to all their shows on that. And you kind of think, okay, if you're actually if you're trying to speak out against this lifestyle, the message is not getting through to your audience because they're getting the opposite message. And the thing is that you're now saying, if you want to develop non-violent readings of things like the Canaanite genocide and Joshua that are consistent with who I believe God is revealed to be in Jesus, one of the tensions is, but throughout history, those readings have not seemed obvious to most Christians. And you have kind of the same problem of ambiguity as you have with Insane Clown Posse, that if the Bible was the product of a maximally wise, good God, then you'd expect the Bible to be maximally effective in forming us into disciples of Jesus, who love our neighbors as ourselves. And yet, you could make a case that the Bible is not what you would expect of a book that would be maximally effective to that end. Now, actually, I do believe it is, because that's speaking out of my faith, but this is still somewhat of an unresolved tension as I wrestle through these issues. So I guess to conclude, what I would say is I had the initial problem of how to reconcile this kind of violence being described, seemingly commended within the Bible. I gave a solution to it, but it now gives a new problem that I have to continue to wrestle with, which is the problem of divine ambiguity in the text. And the best thing for me to address that myself is to try to shine a light rather than curse the darkness. by seeking to disambiguate the text for the Christian community. In other words, to help them to come into what I think is a deeper and more Christ-honoring interpretation and application of the text.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that answer. I think a lot of us struggle with the problem of evil. It seems to be something we hear a lot about, whether on social media or a lot of guests. And I'm excited. I think I've been thinking this whole time, I was like, I need to get a copy of this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I've read parts of it, but I'm in Bible school right now and have millions of textbooks to read, but it's on the top of my list.
I'm going to go to Amazon Books, read the first 60, go to Google Books, read 68 and on.
And don't tell me that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a really exciting and enlightening conversation.
Yeah,
I know for
us.
Derry is a lot more into scholarship and reading scholars than like I've been. So whenever I have questions about stuff, I'm like, yo, how do they understand these topics, and to actually bring these questions to someone who has published work and has thoughtful answers. It has been, well, Derry does have thoughtful answers, but someone who's been in the field a lot longer, has been really enlightening and helpful, and I'm sure it's been helpful for the audience too. So thank you for taking the time to chat with us and hang out.
You bet. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely. And guys, once again, you know where to find us. You got us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Patreon. You hear it every week.
Yeah.
With that.
Oh, wait, Randall, when does your book come out? The new one?
Oh, yeah, we got to talk about that.
Christian Bellows.
So it's Christian Bellows, Timeless Truth in a World of Lies. It comes out, I don't know, probably 2 weeks to 3 weeks from now. So early December, I would say.
We'll link
awesome.
that. We'll link
so that'll be around when this show comes out. So
yeah,
it'll be around the same time.
So check that out. It's in the description below. Buy his book. Don't read the previews. Just buy it. All right, guys.
Awesome.
All right.
See you next week, everybody. Bye.